We have some books. Hello, my friends. I haven't been here in ages, and I'm so sorry. I've had exams. There's nothing else I can say. I've had university exams that were just a lot of work, and so I, didn't have the opportunity to make new videos. At least you had some pre-filmed uploads that you could enjoy. But because of my exams, I think we haven't had a reading wrap up since November, something like that. Or maybe even October. It's possible it was October because I think I had a bit of a reading slump in November, so I didn't read much. But yeah, since December I've read a few books because it's already March. And so I thought we would talk about my recent reads, and let's just get right into it. The book right on top here is A Little Hope. This was a book of the month read of mine. It was basically up for book of the month, and it sounded kind of good, so I picked it. But I have to say I didn't like it very much. This was the first time I think I ever gave 2 stars, and I hate giving out bad ratings, I don't know, but I just genuinely didn't enjoy this book that much. And it's not like there's any reason in here why I hate it or anything. There's nothing special about why this not specifically bad. I think my problem with it was just that it wasn't very good. It is a story about several people from a small town in Connecticut, and everyone has their lives that are difficult. Something has happened to them. Either something is happening to them, so one person gets diagnosed with a very aggressive form of cancer, another person gets into a car accident and talks about their family and what happens. And so everyone is kind of dealing with their own stuff in this book, but at the same time it tries to be very hopeful and very open, I guess, and tries to keep a light tone with these things and kind of talk about the severity of the problems that we can have as people and the hope we can find in those situations, or the good that can come from those situations. But honestly, it was just not deep enough in my opinion. It just wasn't very inspiring. I didn't find any of the people especially likable. I didn't really relate to any of their stories. So there was just nothing about it that was remarkable, so I didn't necessarily like it. And 3 stars is usually a book that I like, that is absolutely fun and enjoyable, but that just doesn't specifically stand out to be 4 or 5 stars, and so I didn't really even like this one that much, so I gave it 2. Yep. That's all I can say. The next book over here is Pachinko, and I absolutely love this book. I saw this, I think, in one of Noelle Gallagher's wrap-ups last year, and it's been on my TBR ever since, and I finally got around to this. I partially listened to this book and partially read it, which was actually a nice way of getting back into reading because I had quite a bit of reading slump in November, and this was the book that kind of got me back into things, which was very cool. This is a multi-generational story that starts in Korea in a time where Japan is still occupying Korea. So this is actually way before World War I or II where this story starts. And Sunja, who is the daughter of a very poor family that owned kind of like a guest house, gets pregnant by a wealthy man who cannot marry her. She comes up with another solution and eventually then moves to Japan with her new husband and has 2 children. Life as an immigrant is not easy for her though, because back then Japanese were extremely racist towards other Asian natives, so they immediately recognize her as Korean and just berate her, and there's tons of structural racism towards Korean people in Japan at the time. So their life turns out to be very, very difficult. And this is basically a multi-generational story of her husband, her children, and eventually their children, and how they just go through life and how they make everything work, how structural racism works through the different times. And it's interesting to see this from a different perspective. I usually read a lot about structural racism in Western nations, but I also found it very interesting to look at it from a Southeast Asian perspective and see what it was like there. And this book spans from the early 1900s until I think in the 1980s. So it actually is a very, very long span of time. The characters are unbelievably lovable. And I also thought it was really interesting to kind of understand why there are two Koreas. I mean, I kind of knew before, but having a fictional family in that time and seeing everything through their lens and how everything happened was actually really interesting. So even historically accurate and also historically super interesting, and made me read a little more on Wikipedia about like the history of Korea, the history of Japan and Vietnam and all of those different countries. So what a great book. I really recommend. I gave this 4 stars. The next book over here is The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. But I think before I talk about this one, I should talk about the first Kristen Hanna I read, which is The Nightingale. This one. So let's talk about this book first. I love this book. And it was such a surprise. So I had heard great things about Kristen Hanna and her writing. I had also heard that some people don't like it because it is a little too corny for them. So I was kind of on the fence on whether I wanted to read a book of hers or not. But since I mentioned I had a reading slump, and my way to get out of reading slumps is to listen to audiobooks. And then I saw that my audiobook app that I use, I think I use Storytel, that it had a copy of The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. And I thought, you know what, let's just give it a try. And I ended up just absolutely loving this book. Oh my God. So I'm looking into my notes on this book and it's like there's so many notes. So the first thing I wrote was, I cried like a little baby, which actually, yes, is true. So for context, I'm going to give you, so I am an American, but I grew up in Germany, right? And in Germany, they're very big on talking about World War II and everything that the Germans did back then, what the Nazis did, to, actually talk about it. And I think it's great. So I've talked about World War II in my schools for years, actually. Almost every single year that topic came up somehow in some different context, and we would work through it. But what I realized when reading this is that I've actually never read much about occupied France. So for those of you who do not know, the Nazis actually occupied France pretty quickly. Earlier in World War II, they pretty much just ran over France, and it was occupied by the Nazis for the longest time. So there was like a German regime, and then there was another part of France in the south of France that was still managed by a French government, but they were eventually also overrun by the Nazis. And actually I had never heard many stories about that time in France, and this is exactly where this book comes in. So this book follows the lives of 2 French sisters, and they both grow up in France, and they're 2 very different people. So one sister is more rebellious, and she's just very active and is super idealistic, and the other sister is more of a calm, laid-back, homemaker type person. War breaks out, and of the older sister, the homemaker, she already has a daughter, and her husband is sent off to war. Then France is occupied by the French, and obviously she's just trying to deal. There's hardly any food out there, and occupied France is just really difficult. She doesn't know how to navigate her life, and then all of a sudden they make her take in a Nazi officer, and she's just completely, she doesn't even know how to deal. And then comes her sister, who has actually been in boarding schools all this time, but then she is sent to her older sister because of the war, and her younger sister, she's being so idealistic and she wants to fight the Nazis and do all this stuff, and then the plot unfolds. I don't want to say much more at this point because there are so many different surprises. It took a while for this story to build up, so like the first 100 pages were really calm. They were actually very chill, and then it's a lot more adventurous than I expected it to be. But in my opinion, this book has all the goods that you need for a good story. What I found amazing about this book is that it is extremely tragic. This is such a sad book, but at the same time, it kept a tone that was hopeful and that was inspiring. And even though the ending is pretty tragic, it's pretty sad, it still didn't feel like a really sad ending. I mean, I cried like a little girl, but also just because I cried at the love of the situation and at everything that it symbolizes, basically. And I love books that can do that, that can show that even sad endings maybe aren't the worst in the world, and that sometimes sad things are part of life and you can still have hope even when sad things are happening. What I also wrote down in my notes is a lot of people nowadays are like, I would have resisted. How could people let everything happen? And I think this book does a really good job of showing why people don't resist. or why resisting may not even be the first thing on your mind. Because when you have kids, when you have family, and you have an oppressive regime where there's, you know, dead people hanging from lampposts, you're not exactly thinking, vive la résistance. I mean, it's not really the first thing you're going to think, and I think this book did just a great job of that. I don't know, have I raved enough about this book? I'm not so sure. It definitely was a big ride. It was extremely emotional for me, and this was an absolute 5-star, which was kind of cool because it was my first 5-star in a while. I mostly listened to this book, but I'm glad I have this copy, and it is a beautiful thing in my collection. Oh my god, we've only talked about 4 books? Shit. This is typical me. Okay. Then we can move on to the next Kristen Hanna, The 4 Winds. I wasn't sure if I should follow up a Kristen Hanna with another Kristen Hanna because sometimes stories can be similar or writers can have similar styles and it's just not as enchanting as it is when you read them back to back. But I still really like this book. So this book plays in the States and at the time of the Dust Bowl. I found it interesting that there are some parallels in these books. So this was about a sister-sister relationship, and this book is mostly about a mother-daughter relationship, actually. And it was interesting to see how this book just characterized that type of relationship differently than this book did. But I think both books did a really good job of grasping that type of relationship and the things you can hate each other for and still love each other for. This book didn't pull me in as much as The Nightingale, but maybe that was just because I read them back to back. What I loved about this book were the character development and the character descriptions. I found them really realistic. The way people behaved in this book and the attachments that you formed. I thought the characters were really likable and lovable, but they still have their faults, you know, they still have their things. And I hate books that have like perfect heroes in them. I can't stand that, and this book certainly didn't do that. The story was very realistic for the time, and I've actually started really liking historical fiction because it does give you a good description of the time, what happened at the time, but it still gives you an emotional, different view of everything when you're reading facts, and you tend to remember more if you have a more emotional connection to the facts, right? And so that's why I actually found this really interesting. I've never read much about the Dust Bowl. I read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, and I absolutely loved that book as well. Yeah, this was just such a different perspective on the time, so I actually started reading way more about the Dust Bowl again. So once again, a very inspiring book, very good book. It also made me cry. It took a bit of an unexpected turn at the end that was a little too surprising for me. It's had some sprinkled romance inside of it, which was also not bad, and yeah, but I did enjoy The Nightingale a bit more than this one. I don't know, this one was more to my taste, but still a great book, and it was 4 stars for me. So I still really greatly enjoyed it. I mean, it still sucked me in there. But I think I'm going to leave it with the Kristen Hanna books for now and wait for a while until I read the next one. So the next book over here is Clap When You Land. I actually listened to this book, and I thought that was such a better idea than actually reading it. This book is written kind of like a poem, I guess. So the style is a little bit different, and I actually really enjoyed the way it was acted out in the audiobook. So highly recommend actually listening to this. And it was such a cool book. So it's about 2 sisters or 2 half-sisters that after the death of their father that they have in common find out that they have a half-sister. What happens here is that the common father of these 2 sisters suddenly dies in a plane crash, and they then figure out that he basically had 2 secret families, one in the States and one in the Dominican Republic, and they kind of find out about each other and the family history and everything else. It wasn't just interesting because of that, because that was just a fascinating concept. Like, wouldn't that be crazy if you found out that you had like siblings somewhere else in the world? I mean, that's just nuts. But it was also really interesting because it was Latinx, and it was about the Dominican Republic and wanting to go to the States, wanting to have a passport, and those dynamics between the different families, not just because of them having the same father who were just trying to keep secrets from each other, but also because one sister grew up in the States and one grew up in the Dominican Republic, and the I guess cultural clashes between the 2 of them. So I really enjoyed this book. It was really fun, and I actually recommend listening to it because it was really nice listen, and just, yeah, the way it was read was really, really cool. Clap When You Land was a 3-star from me, and an absolute recommend. So the next book I have over here is Circe, which was my second book by Madeline Miller. I also read The Song of Achilles last year and I really, really enjoyed it. And ever since then, Circe has been on my list. And I finally got around to reading this book and I really liked it. I've kind of found this thing in Greek mythology. I've really started enjoying Greek mythology a lot more. The stories are just so ultimately epic and it's just really cool. This book is about Circe, who is a son of Helios, god of sun. Is that right? Yes. She kind of does something pretty bad. She's basically finds out that she's a witch when she's growing up, and she turns a nymph into this monster, and because of that she is banished into exile onto her own little island. And this follows her life and the different phases she goes through. It's not as adventurous as The Song of Achilles, so it's a very different story. This is more about her coming onto her own and developing her self-esteem as a person and being her own person and realizing who she is and who she loves and who she needs, and that she really only needs herself. And I think The Song of Achilles was a little different to that, but I still absolutely love this book, and this was just a beautiful story about a woman. Honestly, that's the best way I could describe this. She obviously has a lot of adventures in her life. Kind of cool to see because I also read Ariadne, which is by a different author, but that story was also kind of woven into this one. And it's kind of cool to see these connections come together between the different gods. And the ending was just so poetic. That's the best way to put it. It was a beautiful and poetic ending to this book, and I don't know, it made me think about it for a long time. It was different, but it was very beautiful. 4 stars, by the way. 4 stars for me. So many books around here. So the next book over here, oh god, this was a book that I loved. This book is called The Choice. This was a Book of the Month add-on that I saw and read, and I was immediately like, I have to read this book. This book is a memoir by Edith Eva Eger. She is a survivor of Auschwitz. This book was just beautifully done. I've read several memoirs about Auschwitz. I've read several memoirs about the concentration camps back then, and I think it's unbelievably important to, you don't necessarily have to read the books, but at least confront yourself with that time and think about, I don't know, the evil that can happen in our world and how people survive that. But what I've always been interested in, and no one really talked about this before, or I hadn't found a book that talked about it before, was the PTSD and how people survive after Auschwitz. I mean, surviving something that is that horrendous is one thing, but then, like, how do you even lead a life? I mean, that is so deeply traumatic. That I've always wondered what that aspect is like. This book was amazing because of that. Dr. Eger, she has in the meantime had a PhD in psychology, and she's actually a psychiatrist. She works as a psychiatrist. And in this book, she doesn't only talk about her time in Auschwitz. She talks about growing up, she talks about the Nazis, about everything, but she also talks about her life after and how her PTSD affected the rest of her life. And because she's a psychologist, she's really good at recognizing the different things that she did or decisions she made because she was clouded by trauma. And I thought that was just fantastic to do, because you really get a good idea of, like, how do you even deal with a situation like that, and how does she deal, and how does she eventually, I guess, overcome some of her problems. Later on in the book, she also talks about a few of her patients, of course random and with new names and everything, but she also talks about their traumas and how they affected their lives and why they're doing certain things. So this book didn't just give you the memoir of the thing that happened, but it also gives you the context of life and how to work and live through traumatic experiences. And what I thought was amazing, she put this in the foreword, she was just like, you know, I want you to read this book and I don't want you to think, oh my God, what has this woman been through? How amazing is she? She wants you to read this book and say, wow, if she could do this, I could do this. I can deal with my stuff. Here is how you can deal with your things. And that's also why it's called The Choice, because she keeps emphasizing that we can make choices to find a better path in life as well. So this book was unbelievably empowering, and Just amazing. If you haven't read it yet, please just do. There's no other way to put it. I don't rate memoirs, but I actually did rate this on Storygraph, so I make sure that I do not forget it in my yearly wrap-up. Phenomenal book and completely changed the way I think about other things. Absolute recommend. Okay, we're not done yet. I still have more books. Oh my god, this video is going to be so long. We have Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead over here. I was really looking forward to this book. I love Colson Whitehead. I think he's a wonderful, fantastic author. Everything by him I have just absolutely loved, and I also really, really liked this book. It was a very different vibe to the stories that he'd done before, like the Underground Railroad or even the Nickel Boys. I personally enjoyed the Nickel Boys. I mean, not enjoyed in a good sense, but I just loved that book. And the Harlem Shuffle was a bit of a different vibe, but I was so on board with it. This book follows Carney, and we basically drop in several points in his life, so it's kind of like told through several different stories, through 3, I think, separate stories at different points in Carney's life. And Carney is his dad is a criminal, or was a criminal. That's how he earned his money. That's basically one of the only ways he did. And Carney marries his wife, who is from an, as he calls it sometimes, uppity family, who is not criminal. So they kind of don't like Carney. And Carney built up his own furniture store. We basically start at that point in his life, but he kind of has a bit of a side thing, which is why he says he's a bit crooked but not completely crooked. So he also has his foot in the door in the criminal world, but tries not to get too involved. I loved the atmosphere of this book, which it was just really cool. It was like 1960s New York, and I really felt like I was running around in 1960s New York. The descriptions were just so cool and so on point, and I could really easily imagine what this must have looked like. What an interesting time period. I mean, I find it fascinating that my parents are, sorry mom, that my parents are old enough that they lived through a time that was just so completely different from our own, even though it's not that far back. I mean, the 60s are only 60 years ago, so that's not a huge amount of time, but man, was this fascinating to read it and to just look at it from a historical perspective. And it was fun and adventurous at times, and then on other times it was a little more calm. So all in all, I really, really liked this book. I gave it 3 stars. I enjoyed it very much, and I mostly enjoyed it for its vibe. It was just the coolest vibe ever. I don't know, sometimes you just feel like being in a book, you're not necessarily super involved in the story, but you're super involved in the surroundings of it. And that's kind of what this book felt like. The last physical book, yes, we still have more when we're done with the physical books. Over here is Olive Again. I probably should have read the first book because this is the second book. I mentioned this in my TBR for the end of the year. This book is about Olive, and it was just the cutest story. Honestly, I think this is a kind of book that I might enjoy even more getting older, because in this book Olive is retired. She's a retired teacher, and she kind of just gets into other people's business and just kind of drops in at different people's lives and is either a friend to them. Sometimes she's a teacher to them, sometimes she is made fun of by them. I mean, just different little stories, but I feel like with every life story she just has a different perspective. Olive herself is kind of strict, and it feels like she kind of has something stuck up her ass. She's very straightforward. She is just the way she is. And I feel like, yeah, the older I get, the more I might enjoy this story, because I think there will be certain aspects in here that I enjoy even more. Because it also talks a lot about aging. Olive in this book gets quite old and even leaves her home and remarries a second husband after losing her first husband, and eventually goes into a nursing home. And just seeing her perspective on those different things was just really cool. I don't know, it was just kind of fun to see. If I go into a nursing home in that same headspace that Olive does, then I think I'm okay. Life will be okay. So I think this is one of those books that I will keep and reread maybe in 10 years, in 20 years, and so forth, because it was really sweet. It was really nice to get me back into reading, and I gave this 3.5 stars. Now, on to the audiobooks. I'm so sorry this video is so long. I need to make more wrap-ups in between, but I was studying like crazy. Anyway, I also listened to Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. I've also read Normal People, and Conversations with Friends is, I think, her second book. And I had heard, I don't know, I still am on the fence on whether I like Sally Rooney or not. I just hated all of the characters in Conversations with Friends. I think all of them were so self-serving and so self-involved. It was just incredible. But I mean, you have to be a pretty good author for me to not like one single character you've ever written but still make me finish the book, right? So looking into my notes, I wrote down I really didn't like any of the characters' weird codependent relationships, but somehow very honest. Kudos to Sally Rooney's writing that she could dig up such bad emotions for me, and not because of bad writing, but genuine real emotions that I felt before. But goddamn, I hated everyone's guts. That's my note on the book. So basically the book starts with two friends. They basically befriend this couple. One of the two friends gets involved with the guy from the couple, and it just ends up being really weird codependent relationships where no one really knows what's going on in the relationship, and it reminded me of times where I've just been dating and I wasn't sure what was going on. I was like, oh my God, and you're in that weird situation between real relationship and not real relationship, and I don't know. But at the same time, yeah, she dug up those emotions out of me. I mean, that is an amazing thing as a writer, to be able to dig up crap like that out of a person, even though I hate every single character in the book. That was pretty amazing. I'm gonna read her next book. I mean, she got me hooked, which is, I guess, a sign of a good author, even though I hated everyone's guts. I gave this book 3 stars. I couldn't give it any more because I hated everyone, but maybe 3.5 or 4 might be more accurate, especially when you're talking about the emotional value of the book. To the last book of today, also a book that I only gave 2 stars, is Leave the World Behind. I also found this in my app where I was just listening to my audiobooks, and it sounded kind of interesting, and so I just got into it, but I already saw that it wasn't rated very well, and that maybe should have been the first red flag. But this story it's kind of intriguing. So it's about a family that goes on vacation in this Airbnb outside of the city, and then all of a sudden the owners of the house turn up. The owners of the house as well as the family are both from New York City, but the owners of the house show up and they're like, hey, there was this big blackout in the city and we weren't even sure if we could get back into our apartment because of the electricity going out and the elevator. And so the owners of the house then stay in the Airbnb with the family, and it's obviously a really weird situation. And it's racially kind of interesting because there's a white family staying in the house, but the house is owned by 2 black people, and the family's kind of like, do we feel comfortable with this? Do we even believe that they're the owners of the house? And then they try to grapple with, well, why is that only because I think they're black and they couldn't own it and couldn't be that rich? Or so they're even doubting themselves. So it was actually a very interesting dynamic. And what's interesting about this book is that you don't really know what's going on. So there's this blackout, and they eventually find out that something did happen, and the narrator is omniscient. So you have an omniscient narrator that every once in a while does a little did they know that. So you kind of find out that weird stuff is happening, but I'm not going to talk about the rest of the book because I kept asking myself towards the end of the book, so what happened? What happened? What happened? And yeah, I didn't like this book because essentially nothing happened. I mean, it was just them in this house, and it was them asking themselves the whole time what happened, asking themselves what they should do. Should they go back to the city? Should they stay out there? Should they drive somewhere else? So they just don't know what to do. And that was an interesting part of the book. So asking yourself, what would I do in a catastrophe like that? What would I do in a situation like that? And what are the things you even can do in a situation like that? Because nothing really happened, and because it didn't really have a big moral of the story or anything, when I finished the book, I was kind of like, well, that was a waste of time. So that's why I gave it 2 stars. All in all, it's still very entertaining, especially to listen to it. I listened to it while taking walks in the evening, and it was perfectly fine for that. But yeah, just didn't end up particularly liking it, so I gave it 2 stars. And that concludes all of the books that I have read since December, essentially. I've realized that most of you are mostly interested in reading wrap-ups, which absolutely makes sense to me because that's the time we're really talking about books and getting into books. But I think for videos in between the wrap-ups, I'm just going to do some other fun stuff that may be more lifestyle, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be talking about books anymore. That just means that I'm just making whatever I feel like in between. But thank you for sticking around. I mean, this video, as I'm filming this, it's 43 minutes in, so what the hell am I even doing? Thanks for sticking around. Let me know what you've been reading lately and what you've enjoyed lately. If you've read any of these books and have a different opinion than me, let me know. I'm super interested, and we will see each other soon. Bye!